In the dusty backyard of Copper Ridge, Arizona, a widowed mechanic was about to confront the legacy his estranged father left behind. What started as reluctantly examining a box of inherited junk took a shocking turn when he came face to face with calculations that would change everything. Ray Mendoza wasn't your typical small-town dreamer. For 37 years, he had spent his life fixing broken things with his hands. Known for his quiet persistence and mechanical precision that could coax life back into the most hopeless machinery. When he encountered his father's cracked telescope and incomprehensible star charts scattered across yellowed notebooks, he had no idea he was walking into a discovery worth over $100 million. Ray's decision to repair the broken instrument piece by piece would lead to a legal battle that would pit him against corporate giants and force him to choose between personal wealth and generational healing. What began as a son's reluctant inheritance would become a foundation that democratized wonder itself. The entire astronomy community would never be the same after a mechanic proved that sometimes the most important discoveries come from those brave enough to look further than anyone thinks reasonable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and broken promises. Ray Mendoza sat in the cracked vinyl chair, his calloused hands folded in his lap while papers rustled across the mahogany desk. The man behind it wore a suit that cost more than Ray made in 3 months and spoke in the careful, measured tone of someone delivering news that wouldn't change anything. "I'm sorry for your loss, mister." Kim's amazement and the impossible weight of choices that felt too big for a small-town mechanic to make. "I don't know," Ray said again, but this time the words felt less like uncertainty and more like the beginning of a fight he was finally ready to have. The Copper Ridge Community Center hadn't seen this many people since the high school won state championship in 1987. Ray sat in the front row, feeling the weight of 300 pairs of eyes boring into the back of his skull. The metal folding chair creaked under his nervous shifting as Mayor Patricia Valdez called the emergency town meeting to order. "We're here tonight," the mayor announced, her voice echoing off the cinder block walls, "to discuss the situation regarding Raymond Mendoza's claim to asteroid mining rights and how it affects our community." The murmur that rippled through the crowd carried equal parts excitement and skepticism. Ray had lived in Copper Ridge for 37 years, but tonight he felt like a stranger in his own hometown. The story had broken in the Phoenix Herald 2 days ago. Local mechanic claims rights to $100 million asteroid. The headline made him sound either like a lottery winner or a lunatic, depending on your perspective. Dale Pritchard stood from his seat in the third row, his pressed khakis and polo shirt, making him look like he'd stepped out of a country club catalog. "If I may, Mayor Valdez, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Ray's a good man, but he's not equipped to handle something of this magnitude. The responsible thing would be to let qualified professionals manage this discovery." "Qualified professionals like you?" called out Maria Santos from the back. She owned the diner where Ray ate breakfast most mornings, and her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd watched Dale buy up half the town over the past decade. "I have the resources and experience to turn this discovery into something that benefits everyone," Dale replied smoothly. "Jobs, infrastructure, economic development. Ray keeping those rights tied up in legal battles helps nobody." Ray's hands clenched in his lap. He wanted to stand up, wanted to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat like they always did when people with college degrees started talking about things he supposedly didn't understand. Old Pete Kowalski saved him the trouble. Pete had worked alongside Ray at the garage for 15 years before his arthritis forced him into retirement. He hauled his bent frame out of his chair and faced the crowd with the stubborn dignity of someone who'd spent his life fixing things other people had broken. "Dale Pritchard talking about what's good for this town is like a fox explaining why the henhouse needs better security," Pete said, his voice raspy but carrying clearly. "Ray's father discovered that rock. Ray's got every right to decide what happens to it." "Franklin Mendoza was a crackpot," shouted Jim Bradley from near the door. "Spent 20 years staring at the sky while his family fell apart. Now we're supposed to believe he found some magic space treasure?" "He wasn't a crackpot," Ray said, surprising himself by speaking. The room fell quiet, and he felt 300 pairs of eyes shift to him like spotlights. He was obsessed, maybe. He made mistakes with his family. But he wasn't wrong about the asteroid. Ray stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. Dr. Kim at the university confirmed it. The asteroid exists. It's worth what they're saying. And my father documented everything properly, even if he never filed the right paperwork. So what are you going to do about it? Asked Sarah Chen, who taught third grade and had a way of cutting through nonsense that made grown men fidget like schoolchildren. Ray looked around the room at faces he'd known for decades. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose car he'd kept running for 10 years past its expiration date. Tom Martinez, who'd given him his first job and never once complained when Ray took time off to care for Elena during her final months. Jenny Walsh, who still brought him casseroles sometimes because she worried he wasn't eating enough. These people weren't his enemies, even the ones who doubted him. They were just scared and confused and hoping that someone else would make the hard decisions for them. I'm going to fight for it, Ray said, his voice growing stronger. Not because I want to get rich, but because my father spent his life trying to prove something important, and I'm not going to let people like Dale Pritchard turn his discovery into just another way to make the rich richer. The room erupted in voices, some supportive, some angry, all of them loud enough to make Ray's ears ring. But through the chaos, he heard a sound that made him turn toward the door. Applause. Slow, deliberate clapping from someone who'd just slipped in during his speech. It was Sophia Reyes, a 16-year-old girl from the trailer park on the edge of town. She was small for her age, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and clothes that had seen better years, but her eyes burned with the kind of intensity Ray recognized from his father's old photographs. Mr. Mendoza, she called out, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Could you teach me how to use that telescope? The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different, expectant, maybe even hopeful. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Ray looked at Sophia, seeing something in her face that reminded him of himself at that age, back when he'd believed that understanding how things worked was the same as being able to fix them. Back when his father's obsessions had seemed like magic instead of madness. Yeah, Ray said, and for the first time in weeks he smiled. I think I can do that. Dale Pritchard was already pulling out his phone as people began filing out of the community center, but Ray wasn't watching him anymore. He was looking at Sophia, who was bouncing on her toes with excitement, and thinking about all the ways the universe might be bigger than he'd ever imagined. The next morning, Ray found Miggs in the kitchen, staring at his phone with an expression somewhere between amazement and horror. We're famous, Miggs said, turning the screen toward his father. Look at this. The video had been posted to social media the night before by someone at the town meeting. It showed Ray standing in front of the crowd, looking nervous but determined, as he talked about fighting for his father's discovery. The caption read, Small Town Mechanic versus Corporate Greed, David and Goliath in the Space Age. Ray watched himself on the tiny screen, barely recognizing the man who'd found the courage to speak up in front of the whole town. The video had been shared thousands of times, with comments ranging from supportive to skeptical to downright cruel. This is what you wanted? Miggs asked, and Ray could hear the confusion in his son's voice. To be some kind of symbol? Ray sat down across from Miggs, studying his son's face for clues about what he was really asking. At 17, Miggs was caught between childhood and whatever came next, between believing in his father and protecting himself from disappointment. I wanted to do the right thing, Ray said finally. I'm still not sure what that is, but I know it's not letting Dale Pritchard buy our family's history for $5 million. Miggs was quiet for a long moment, scrolling through comments on the video. Some people called Ray a hero, others called him a fool. Most seemed to think he was just another small-town dreamer who'd gotten in over his head. Sophia Reyes came by this morning, Miggs said eventually. She wants to know when you're going to start teaching her about astronomy. What did you tell her? That you're not really a teacher. That you just learned how to fix the telescope a few weeks ago. Miggs looked up from his phone. But she said that's exactly why she wants to learn from you. Because you're figuring it out as you go along, just like she is. Ray felt something shift in his chest. A recognition that maybe the point wasn't to be perfect or fully prepared. Maybe the point was just to be willing to try, to pass along whatever small understanding you'd managed to gather, even if it wasn't complete. Tell her to come by tonight, Ray said. We'll start with the basics. Outside, the desert morning was painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere above them, invisible in the daylight, an asteroid named 2003 FM was following its ancient orbit around the sun. Ray's father had spent 20 years tracking that small piece of rock and metal, and now it had become the center of a story Ray was still learning how to tell. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked apologetic as he handed Ray the thick manila envelope. Inside were 47 pages of dense legal language that boiled down to a simple message. Dale Pritchard and Titan Mining Corporation were challenging Ray's claim to the asteroid in federal court. Ray sat at his kitchen table, reading through accusations that he lacked the technical expertise, financial resources, and legal standing to own rights to anything more valuable than the broken-down truck in his driveway. The papers painted him as an opportunist, trying to profit from his father's delusions, a small-town mechanic who'd stumbled into something he couldn't possibly understand. "They're trying to make me disappear," Ray told Dr. Kim when he called her that afternoon. "Make it sound like I'm some kind of fraud." "That's exactly what they're doing," Leah replied from her office at the university. "It's a standard corporate strategy. Attack the person's credibility, make the case about character instead of facts. But Ray, the facts are on your side. Your father's documentation is solid. His calculations were correct. The discovery is legitimate." Ray stared out his kitchen window at the telescope in his backyard, remembering the night he'd first looked through it and seen Jupiter's moons. Such a small thing. Really, 4 tiny points of light that most people would never notice. But Franklin had seen them, had understood what they meant, had spent his life looking for things that others missed. "What do I need to do?" Ray asked. "We need to file a response. Establish your legal standing based on inheritance and documentation. I can help with the technical aspects, but you'll need a lawyer. A good one." Ray thought about his savings account, which contained approximately $800, and the loose change from his truck's ashtray. Good lawyers probably cost more per hour than he made in a week. But before he could explain his financial situation, Leah continued. "There's something else. Sophia Reyes called me. She said you're teaching her astronomy?" "Just the basics. How to find constellations, use the telescope. She's smart, picks things up fast. She wants to apply for our summer research program. High school students who show exceptional promise in STEM fields. Full scholarship, including housing and meals." Ray felt a surge of pride, mixed with something that might have been hope. Sophia had been coming by every evening for 2 weeks, her notebook filled with careful drawings of star patterns and detailed questions about orbital mechanics that challenged Ray to learn more than he was teaching. "She deserves that chance," Ray said. "She does. And Ray, her application essay is about you. About how you're proving that scientific discovery isn't just for people with fancy degrees. That sometimes the most important insights come from people who approach problems differently." That evening, Ray found Sophia in his backyard, adjusting the telescope's focus with the careful precision of someone who understood that small movements could reveal entire worlds. In the 2 weeks since the town meeting, she'd become a regular fixture at the Mendoza house, her enthusiasm for learning balanced by a practical intelligence that reminded Ray of Elena. "Mr. Mendoza," Sophia said without looking away from the eyepiece, "I've been thinking about your father's calculations, the ones about the asteroid's composition. What about them? If he was right about the platinum and rare earth metals, then this isn't just about money. Those materials are essential for renewable energy technology. Electric car batteries, solar panels. Your father might have found something that could help solve climate change." Ray joined her at the telescope, looking up at stars that seemed brighter and more numerous every night he spent studying them. Sophia had a way of seeing connections that he missed, of understanding that individual discoveries were part of larger patterns. "Dr. Kim thinks you should apply to her summer program," Ray said. Sophia's face lit up with an excitement that made her look younger than her 16 years. "Really? She said I could apply?" "She said you already did, and that your essay was about me, which seems like a waste of good writing." "It's not a waste," Sophia said seriously. "You're important, not because you're perfect, but because you're proof that science belongs to everyone. That discovery comes from curiosity and persistence, not just from having the right credentials." They spent the next hour looking at Saturn, its rings visible as a thin line through Franklin's repaired telescope. Sophia had learned to sketch what she saw, her notebook filling with detailed observations that captured not just the visual details, but the wonder of seeing something that existed 4 billion years ago and 900 million miles away. When she finally headed home, walking across the desert with a confidence that belonged to someone who'd learned to navigate by starlight, Ray felt something he hadn't experienced since Elena's death: the satisfaction of nurturing someone else's dream. Inside the house, Miggs was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, reading news articles about the legal challenge. At 17, he'd developed the skeptical intelligence of someone who'd learned not to expect good things to last. "They're really going to fight this," Miggs said, scrolling through headlines that painted his father as either a folk hero or a delusional opportunist. "Dale Pritchard's got lawyers and PR people and a mining corporation backing him up. What do we have?" Ray looked around the kitchen at the accumulated evidence of his ordinary life. Bills held to the refrigerator with magnets, coffee stains on the counter, the telescope manual open to a page about planetary observation. Nothing that looked like preparation for a legal battle that would determine his family's future. "We have the truth," Ray said, though the words sounded inadequate even to him. "The truth doesn't always win," Miggs replied, and Ray heard an echo of his own voice from years of explaining why life wasn't fair, why good people sometimes lost everything, why hoping for better was often just another form of disappointment. "Maybe not," Ray said, "but it's what we've got." Later that night, Ray sat in his backyard with Franklin's notebooks spread around him like a puzzle he was finally beginning to solve. The legal papers lay on the table beside him, their threatening language made small by the vastness of the desert sky. Somewhere above him, 2003 FM continued its ancient orbit, carrying its cargo of precious metals through space that had never heard of corporations or courtrooms, or the small human dramas that played out beneath the stars. Ray thought about Sophia and her dreams of studying the universe, about Miggs and his fear of inherited disappointment, about Franklin and the 20 years he'd spent trying to prove that he'd seen something real. Tomorrow there would be lawyers and reporters and people who wanted to reduce his father's discovery to dollar signs and legal precedents. But tonight there were just the stars, burning with the same light they'd cast when Franklin first saw them, when Sophia first looked through the telescope, when Ray himself had realized that fixing broken things was just another way of believing in second chances. Ray opened one of his father's notebooks to a page marked, "For Ray if you're reading this." The handwriting was shaky, written near the end of Franklin's life, but the words were clear. "Son, I know I wasn't the father you needed. I spent so much time looking up that I forgot to look around. But the asteroid is real, and it's important, and if you're holding this notebook, then maybe I managed to leave you something valuable after all. Not the money, though that would be nice. The proof that sometimes the crazy ones are right. That sometimes looking further than anyone else thinks is reasonable leads to discoveries that matter. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to help you fight for this. But you're stronger than you know. And you understand things I never learned about fixing what's broken. Don't let them tell you this doesn't belong to you. It's yours by right of inheritance and by right of caring enough to look." Ray closed the notebook and looked up at the constellation Cassiopeia, spread across the northern sky like a promise written in light. His father had been right about the asteroid, but more than that, he'd been right about the importance of looking further than seemed reasonable, of believing that small discoveries could lead to larger truths. The legal battle would be difficult, probably impossible, but Ray was no longer the man who'd inherited a broken telescope and a box of incomprehensible charts. He was someone who'd learned to see past the obvious, to find value in things that others dismissed, to understand that sometimes the most important fights were the ones that seemed hopeless from the beginning. Judge Patricia Marlowe's courtroom felt like a cathedral built for arguing instead of praying. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and windows that let in just enough light to remind everyone that the real world existed somewhere beyond these walls. Ray sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded on the polished surface, wearing the only suit he owned, a navy blue relic from Elena's funeral that still smelled faintly of mothballs. Across the aisle, Dale Pritchard's legal team occupied a table that looked like mission control, laptops and tablets and stacks of documents arranged with military precision. Dale himself sat in the front row behind them, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ray's truck, his expression confident in the way that only came from years of winning battles he'd paid other people to fight. "Mr. Mendoza," said Ray's lawyer Janet Rodriguez, who'd taken the case pro bono after reading about it in the Phoenix Herald, "this is your moment to tell your story. Remember, Judge Marlowe isn't interested in sympathy. She wants facts, documentation, and proof that your claim is legitimate." Ray nodded, though his throat felt like he'd been swallowing desert sand. In the gallery behind him, he could see familiar faces. Dr. Kim, Sophia, Pete from the garage, even Miggs, who'd driven down from school for the hearing. Their presence was comforting and terrifying in equal measure, witnesses to either his vindication or his complete humiliation. Judge Marlowe was a former Air Force pilot who'd earned her law degree while serving as a JAG officer. She had short gray hair, sharp eyes, and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent years making life-and-death decisions in situations where hesitation meant disaster. Ray had read her biography online and learned that she'd once been a test pilot, which seemed like either perfect preparation for judging asteroid mining disputes or a cosmic joke about his chances. "This court is now in session," Judge Marlowe announced, her voice carrying easily through the high-ceilinged room. "We're here to determine the legitimacy of Raymond Mendoza's claim to Asteroid 2003 FM and the validity of his inherited documentation supporting that claim." Dale's lawyer, a silver-haired man named Preston Wade, who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate recruiting poster, stood to deliver his opening statement. He painted Ray as a well-meaning but unqualified dreamer who'd misunderstood his father's amateur observations and was now trying to cash in on a discovery he couldn't possibly verify or develop. "Your Honor," Wade said in the smooth tones of someone accustomed to swaying juries, "while we sympathize with Mr. Mendoza's desire to honor his father's memory, sympathy cannot override the fundamental requirements of space mining law. Franklin Mendoza never filed proper discovery claims. He never demonstrated the technical expertise or financial resources necessary to develop asteroid mining operations. His son, while clearly well-intentioned, lacks even the basic qualifications to maintain such a claim." Ray felt his jaw tighten as Wade spoke, but Janet had warned him about this. Corporate lawyers always tried to make their opponents feel small, to reduce complex human stories to simple matters of credentials and paperwork. When his turn came, Ray stood slowly and walked to the witness stand, feeling like he was approaching the edge of a cliff he'd been afraid to look over his entire life. The bailiff swore him in, and Judge Marlowe fixed him with a stare that seemed to see through pretense and small talk straight to whatever truth lay underneath. "Mr. Mendoza," Janet began, "please tell the court about your father's work on Asteroid 2003 FM." Ray took a breath and began to speak about Franklin's obsession, his notebooks full of calculations, his 20-year quest to prove the asteroid's existence and composition. He explained how he'd inherited the telescope and documentation, how Dr. Kim had verified the scientific accuracy of Franklin's work, how the asteroid represented not just a financial opportunity, but validation of a man who'd sacrificed everything for his belief in something invisible to most people. "My father wasn't perfect," Ray said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "He chose his work over his family. He let his obsession hurt the people who loved him. But he wasn't wrong about the asteroid. He saw something that nobody else bothered to look for, and he spent his life documenting it with the kind of precision that didn't leave room for doubt." Preston Wade stood for cross-examination, his questions designed to highlight Ray's lack of formal education, his blue-collar background, his complete inexperience with space mining technology. "Mr. Mendoza, do you have any engineering degrees? Any background in aerospace technology? Any experience managing projects worth more than $100 million? "No," Ray replied to each question, feeling smaller with every admission. "Then what exactly qualifies you to claim ownership of one of the most valuable asteroid discoveries in human history?" Ray looked out at the gallery, seeing Sophia's encouraging nod, Miggs's worried expression, Dr. Kim's confidence in the validity of Franklin's work. He thought about the nights he'd spent repairing the telescope, learning to see the universe through his father's eyes, understanding for the first time that discovery and credentials weren't the same thing. "I'm qualified because I cared enough to look," Ray said finally. "Because I took my father's broken telescope and his scattered notes, and I put them back together piece by piece until they made sense. Because I didn't give up when people told me it was impossible or pointless or crazy. You asked what qualifies me. The same thing that qualified my father, the willingness to believe that seeing something important was worth more than being comfortable." Dr. Kim's testimony provided the scientific foundation for Ray's claim. She explained Franklin's methodology, the accuracy of his calculations, the legitimacy of his documentation. Under cross-examination, she held her ground against Wade's attempts to minimize Franklin's credentials. Franklin Mendoza was blacklisted for political reasons, not scientific ones, she stated firmly. His work on 2003 FM was rigorous, well-documented, and completely accurate. The fact that he couldn't get institutional support doesn't diminish the validity of his discovery. The hearing lasted 3 days, filled with technical testimony about space mining law, asteroid composition analysis, and the bureaucratic requirements for claiming ownership of celestial objects. Ray listened to experts debate his father's legacy in language that reduced 20 years of obsession to charts and graphs and legal precedents. On the final day, Judge Marlowe asked a question that caught everyone off guard. Mr. Mendoza, assume for a moment that this court rules in your favor. What would you do with an asteroid worth over $100 million? The courtroom fell silent. Ray looked at Dale Pritchard, whose confident expression had shifted to something more uncertain. He thought about Sophia's dreams of studying the universe, about his father's notebooks filled with calculations that nobody had bothered to verify, about all the kids who might never get the chance to look through a telescope because they'd been told that science belonged to other people. I'd start a foundation, Ray said, in my father's name, to teach astronomy and space science to kids who don't have access to fancy equipment or expensive programs. Kids like Sophia Reyes, who's sitting in this courtroom right now because she believes that understanding the universe is worth fighting for. Judge Marlowe nodded slowly, making notes on her legal pad. And you would give up personal wealth worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars to fund educational programs. Yes, Your Honor. Because my father didn't spend 20 years tracking that asteroid so I could get rich. He did it because he believed that discovery matters, that looking further than anyone thinks is reasonable can lead to something important. Money can't buy that kind of legacy, but a foundation could preserve it. The judge called for a recess, leaving Ray to sit in the courthouse hallway while she deliberated. Miggs found him there, sitting on a bench beneath fluorescent lights that made everything look pale and uncertain. You really meant that? Miggs asked. About giving up the money for a foundation? Ray looked at his son, seeing Elena's eyes and his own stubborn determination reflected back at him. I meant it. Does that disappoint you? Miggs was quiet for a long moment, studying his father's face as if seeing him clearly for the first time. No, he said finally. It makes me proud of you. It makes me proud to be your son. When court reconvened, Judge Marlowe delivered her ruling with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd made difficult decisions in more dangerous circumstances than a federal courtroom. This court finds that Franklin Mendoza's documentation of Asteroid 2003 FM constitutes valid scientific discovery under current space mining statutes. His heir, Raymond Mendoza, has demonstrated both legal standing to inherit those discovery rights and sufficient commitment to develop them responsibly. This court hereby recognizes Mr. Mendoza's claim to Asteroid 2003 FM, subject to standard regulatory oversight and environmental protection requirements. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and Ray felt something shift inside his chest. Not triumph exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes persistence mattered more than preparation, that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that let you honor the people who believed in impossible things. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Ray like moths, drawn to unexpected light. He answered their questions as best he could, explaining that the asteroid belonged not to him, but to his father's memory, and that its value would be measured not in dollars, but in the dreams it could help other people pursue. That night, Ray sat in his backyard, with the telescope pointed at coordinates he now knew by heart. Somewhere above him, 2003 FM continued its ancient orbit, no longer just a point of light, but a bridge between his father's obsession and his son's future, between one man's lonely discovery and a foundation that could teach other people to look up at the sky and believe that what they saw there mattered. The morning after the court ruling, Ray woke to find 17 missed calls on his phone and a news van parked in his driveway. Through his bedroom window, he could see a reporter adjusting her hair in the side mirror of a white sedan, while a cameraman tested his equipment against the backdrop of Ray's modest house and the telescope that had started everything. He made coffee in the dark kitchen, listening to the voices outside discussing camera angles and lighting as if his life had become a set for someone else's story. The first message on his phone was from Dale Pritchard, left at 2:47 a.m., the voice tight with barely controlled anger. This isn't over, Mendoza. You think winning in court means you've won everything, but you have no idea what you're up against. Running a foundation, managing that kind of money, dealing with federal regulators and mining corporations, you're going to crash and burn, and when you do, I'll be there to pick up the pieces for a fraction of what I offered you yesterday. Ray deleted the message and moved to the next one, Dr. Kim congratulating him and offering to help establish the scientific framework for the foundation. Pete from the garage, proud and slightly drunk, rambling about how Franklin would have been amazed to see his son vindicated. Sophia, breathless with excitement about the possibilities ahead. But it was the last message that made Ray pause, from a number he didn't recognize, a woman's voice professional but warm. Mr. Mendoza, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from NASA's Near-Earth Object Program. We've been following your case with great interest. I wonder if we might discuss a potential partnership between your foundation and our educational outreach initiatives. Please call when you have a moment. Ray sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone and trying to process the idea that NASA, the organization that had blacklisted his father, was now interested in working with him. The irony felt too large for his small kitchen to contain. Miggs appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school despite the early hour. At 17, he'd developed the ability to navigate chaos with the casual efficiency of someone who'd learned that stability was temporary and adaptation was survival. There are reporters in our driveway, Miggs said, pouring himself orange juice from a carton that had seen better days. I noticed. They want to interview me about growing up as the grandson of the visionary astronomer Franklin Mendoza, Miggs made air quotes with his fingers. Apparently, I'm part of a multi-generational legacy of scientific discovery. Ray studied his son's face, looking for clues about how he felt about suddenly being part of a story that painted their family as something more noble than a widowed mechanic and his skeptical teenager. What did you tell them? That I'm late for calculus class. Miggs finished his juice and grabbed his backpack. But Dad, when you talk to NASA, ask them why it took them 20 years to realize Grandpa was right. After Miggs left for school, Ray sat in his backyard with Franklin's notebook spread around him like a map to a territory he was still learning to navigate. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and creosote from the desert beyond his fence. In a few hours, the temperature would climb toward 90 degrees, but for now the world felt balanced between seasons, between the man he'd been and whoever he was becoming. Sophia found him there an hour later, her bicycle propped against his gate and her notebook clutched against her chest like a shield. She'd been accepted to Dr. Kim's summer program, but that was still months away, and Ray could see in her expression the same hunger for knowledge that had driven his father to spend 20 years tracking a single point of light. Mr. Mendoza, she said, settling into the folding chair he'd started keeping beside the telescope. My mom heard on the radio that you're going to start a foundation for kids like me. That's the plan, though I'm not exactly sure how to build a foundation. Never done anything like that before. Sophia opened her notebook to a page covered with sketches of telescopes and star charts, her careful handwriting filling the margins with questions about orbital mechanics and gravitational forces. Could I help, she asked. I mean, I know I'm just a kid, but I've been thinking about what kids like me need. Not just equipment, but teachers who understand what it's like to start from nothing. People who can explain things without making you feel stupid for not already knowing them. Ray looked at Sophia's drawings, seeing in them the same careful observation that filled his father's notebooks. But where Franklin's work had been solitary, driven by obsession and isolation, Sophia's approach was different, curious but grounded, ambitious but connected to the world around her. What would you call it? Ray asked. The foundation. Sophia was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness of someone who understood that names mattered, that they carried weight beyond their simple sound. The Franklin Mendoza Foundation for Accessible Astronomy, she said finally. Because your father's discovery shouldn't just belong to people who can afford expensive equipment or fancy schools. It should belong to anyone who's willing to look up and wonder what's out there. That afternoon, Ray drove to the university to meet with Dr. Kim and discuss the practical aspects of turning his court victory into something that could actually help people. The campus felt like another planet. All manicured lawns and brick buildings that spoke of institutional permanence, of knowledge accumulated and preserved across generations. Leah's office was exactly what Ray had expected. Books stacked on every surface, star charts taped to the walls, and a computer screen displaying orbital data that looked like abstract art. She greeted him with coffee and a stack of documents that outlined the legal and financial requirements for establishing a scientific foundation. It's more complicated than just wanting to help kids, she explained. spreading papers across her desk like pieces of a puzzle. Federal regulations, tax exemptions, board of directors, educational curricula, safety protocols. You're talking about building an institution, not just sharing your telescope with the neighborhood. Ray felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settling on his shoulders, the sense that he'd wandered into a conversation where everyone else knew the rules and he was making them up as he went along. Maybe I should just sell the rights to someone who knows what they're doing, he said. Dale was right about one thing. I don't have any experience managing something this big. Leo looked at him with the patience of someone who'd spent years explaining complex concepts to people who thought they weren't smart enough to understand them. Ray, do you know what killed most amateur astronomy programs in public schools? Professional administrators who understood bureaucracy but had never spent a night looking through a telescope. They turned wonder into worksheets, discovery into standardized testing. You don't need experience managing institutions. You need the ability to remember what it felt like the first time you saw Saturn's rings. That evening, Ray called the number Dr. Chen had left. The conversation lasted 2 hours, covering everything from NASA's educational outreach budget to the technical requirements for mobile observatory programs. By the end of the call, Ray had agreed to visit NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center to discuss a partnership that could provide equipment and expertise while preserving the Foundation's focus on accessibility. Mr. Mendoza, Dr. Chen said as they concluded their conversation, I want you to know that many of us have followed your father's work over the years. Franklin was blacklisted for political reasons, not scientific ones. His observations were always rigorous, his calculations always accurate. In many ways, this partnership feels like a long overdue apology. After hanging up, Ray sat in his kitchen and tried to imagine his father's reaction to NASA calling to apologize, to offer partnership instead of persecution. Franklin had died believing himself a failure, a man whose obsession had cost him everything and produced nothing of value. But maybe that had never been true. Maybe the value had just been waiting for someone willing to look for it. Miggs found him there when he came home from school, staring at Franklin's notebooks as if they contained instructions for navigating a future that felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable. How was NASA? Miggs asked, dropping his backpack by the door with the casual grace of someone whose life had recently become too strange for surprise. They want to help. They want to fund mobile observatories, provide training for volunteers, develop curricula that could reach thousands of kids. Miggs sat down across from his father, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read between the lines of adult conversations. But you're scared, Miggs said, and it wasn't a question. Terrified, Ray admitted. What if I mess this up? What if I take your grandfather's discovery and turn it into just another failed project? What if I'm not smart enough or organized enough or whatever enough to make this work? Miggs was quiet for a long moment, looking around the kitchen at the accumulated evidence of their ordinary life. Bills held to the refrigerator with magnets, coffee stains on the counter, the telescope manual still open to a page about planetary observation. Dad, he said finally, you took a broken telescope and a box of crazy notes and turned them into a $100 million court victory. You convinced a federal judge that a high school dropout deserved to own an asteroid. You inspired Sophia to believe she could study the universe, and you made me proud to be your son for the first time in years. I think you're probably smart enough to figure out how to help kids look at stars. Ray looked at his son and saw Elena's wisdom reflected in eyes that had learned to hope again, to believe that sometimes the impossible was just another word for things that hadn't happened yet. Outside, the desert evening was painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Soon it would be dark enough to see the stars, to point the telescope at coordinates his father had spent 20 years calculating. But for now, Ray was content to sit in his kitchen with his son, planning a future that would honor the past while reaching towards something they were still learning to imagine. The Copper Ridge Youth Space Camp occupied a former mining facility 20 miles outside town, its repurposed buildings and makeshift observatory platforms giving it the appearance of a scientific outpost on an alien world. Ray stood on the main stage looking out at 200 faces that ranged from 8 to 18 years old, all of them unified by the kind of curiosity that had once driven his father to spend sleepless nights tracking invisible objects across the sky. Most of you have probably heard the story by now, Ray began, his voice carrying clearly through the portable sound system that Sophia had helped him test that morning, about the telescope and the asteroid and the court case. But that's not really what I want to talk about today. In the front row, Sophia sat with her notebook open, ready to capture whatever wisdom Ray might accidentally stumble upon. Beside her, Miggs operated a video camera with the casual competence of someone who'd grown up in the age of social media documentation. Behind them, scattered throughout the audience, Ray could see faces he'd begun to recognize. Kids from Copper Ridge and the surrounding towns, young people whose parents had driven them hours to attend a camp that promised to teach them that the universe was bigger and more accessible than they'd ever imagined. "I want to talk about my father," Ray continued, finding his rhythm as he spoke. "Franklin Mendoza was not a perfect man. He was obsessed with things that most people couldn't see, and that obsession cost him relationships with the people who loved him. But he taught me something important, even though he probably didn't realize he was teaching it." Ray clicked to the first slide of his presentation, a photograph of Franklin taken in the 1990s, bent over his telescope in the backyard of the house where Ray had grown up. The image was grainy, lit by the amber glow of a work light, but it captured something essential about the man who'd spent 20 years looking for proof that he wasn't crazy. "He taught me that discovery doesn't require permission," Ray said, "that seeing something important is worth more than being comfortable or accepted or understood by people who've stopped looking for new things. My father never had a PhD. He never worked for NASA or a major university. He was just a man who believed that what he saw through his telescope mattered, and he was willing to spend his life proving it." The audience was quiet, absorbed in a story that many of them recognized from their own lives. The experience of being passionate about things that other people dismissed, of having ideas that seemed too big for the circumstances that contained them. Ray clicked to the next slide, a photo of Sophia at his telescope, her eye pressed to the eyepiece with the focused intensity of someone discovering that the universe was larger than she'd previously imagined. "This is Sophia Reyes. She's 16 years old, she lives in a trailer park, and she's going to study astrophysics at the university next year on a full scholarship. 6 months ago, she'd never looked through a telescope, but she asked the right question, not whether she was smart enough or qualified enough to study the stars, but whether the stars were interesting enough to deserve her attention." Sophia blushed but didn't look away from Ray's gaze, understanding that she'd become part of a story larger than herself, a symbol of possibility for other kids who might be sitting in similar audiences wondering if science was something that belonged to them. "The Franklin Mendoza Foundation isn't about my father's asteroid," Ray continued. "It's about the idea that curiosity is more important than credentials, that asking good questions matters more than having perfect answers, that discovery is something you do, not something you are." For the next hour, Ray talked about the practical aspects of amateur astronomy, how to build simple telescopes from hardware store materials, how to find objects in the night sky without expensive equipment, how to make observations that contributed to actual scientific research. But more than that, he talked about the emotional experience of looking up at something vast and distant and feeling connected to it, about the way that understanding even small things about the universe could change how you saw everything else. When he finished speaking, the questions came in a flood. How do you calculate orbital periods? What's the difference between asteroids and comets? How do you know if what you're seeing is real or just wishful thinking? Ray answered what he could and admitted ignorance when he couldn't, demonstrating the kind of intellectual honesty that had once made his father's documentation so credible. But it was the last question that caught him off guard, asked by a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her voice clear and serious as she stood up in the back of the audience. "Mr. Mendoza, do you think your father would be proud of what you're doing?" Ray felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that the answer to that question contained everything he'd been trying to understand about legacy and redemption and the ways that broken things could be repaired across generations. "I think," Ray said slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that some truths were too important to get wrong, "that my father spent his life believing he was a failure because he couldn't make other people see what he saw. But he wasn't trying to become famous or get rich or prove that he was smarter than everyone else. He was trying to understand something beautiful and share that understanding with the world. So yes, I think he'd be proud. Not because I won a court case or started a foundation, but because I finally learned to look up." That evening, the camp organized a stargazing session, using telescopes that had been donated by astronomy clubs from across the region. Ray moved from group to group, helping kids focus their instruments, showing them how to find objects that his father had spent decades studying. The air was clear and cold, perfect for observation, and the desert sky blazed with more stars than most of the campers had ever seen. Miggs found him near midnight, standing apart from the main groups and looking up at the constellation Cassiopeia with an expression that combined wonder and grief in equal measure. "Good talk today," Mig said, settling beside his father on a folding chair that someone had abandoned near the edge of the camp's perimeter. "Think so. I felt like I was making it up as I went along. Maybe that's what made it good. You sounded like someone who was still figuring things out, not like someone who already had all the answers." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the camp's activities wind down as volunteers helped pack equipment and parents arrived to collect tired but excited children. In a few hours, the desert would be empty again, returned to the silence that had surrounded Franklin's solitary observations. But the conversation started here would continue in backyards and classrooms and bedrooms, where kids would lie awake wondering about the size of the universe. "I'd been thinking," Miggs said eventually, "about college, about what I want to study." Ray turned to look at his son, seeing in his profile the combination of Elena's thoughtfulness and his own stubborn determination to understand how things worked. "Computer science, right? Video game design?" "Maybe, or maybe astrophysics. Or maybe both. There's a lot of overlap in the programming and mathematical modeling." Miggs paused, as if testing the weight of his next words before speaking them aloud. "I want to help you with the foundation. Not just the website and social media stuff, but the real work. The education programs and the mobile observatories and all of it." Ray felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, understanding that his son was offering him something more valuable than partnership, the chance to build something together, to create a legacy that belonged to both of them instead of inheriting one that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding. "Your mother would have been proud of both of us," Ray said, and for the first time in years the statement felt like celebration rather than mourning. Above them the stars burned with the same light they'd cast when Franklin first saw them, when Sophia first looked through Ray's telescope, when generations of dreamers had wondered if the patterns they saw in the sky meant something more than random arrangement of distant suns. Tomorrow there would be practical considerations, budgets and curricula, and the endless bureaucratic requirements of turning good intentions into functional institutions. But tonight, there was just the desert silence and the vast sky, and the understanding that sometimes the most important inheritance wasn't money or property, but the willingness to believe that looking further than seemed reasonable could lead to discoveries that mattered. The construction site buzzed with activity that seemed impossible for something taking place in the middle of the Arizona desert. Ray stood beside his truck, watching contractors pour the foundation for what would become the Franklin Mendoza Center for Accessible Astronomy, while earth movers sculpted the surrounding terrain into shapes that would support 3 observatory domes and a visitor center designed to welcome school groups from across the Southwest. The location had been Sophia's idea, 20 acres of desert land donated by a rancher whose granddaughter had attended the youth space camp and come home talking about orbital mechanics with the same enthusiasm she'd once reserved for horses. The site offered perfect viewing conditions, minimal light pollution, and enough space to accommodate the mobile observatory program that NASA had agreed to fund. "It's really happening," Dr. Kim said, joining Ray beside his truck with 2 cups of coffee from the construction trailer that served as temporary headquarters. "6 months ago, this was just an idea. Now look at it." Ray accepted the coffee gratefully, using the warmth to combat the early morning chill that would disappear as soon as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky. The past 6 months had passed in a blur of planning meetings, permit applications, and the kind of bureaucratic complexity that made asteroid mining seem simple by comparison. But somehow, with help from NASA, the university, and a growing network of volunteers who believed in the Foundation's mission, the impossible had begun to take solid form. The center would include classrooms equipped with the latest technology, housing for visiting student groups, and a workshop where kids could learn to build their own telescopes, using techniques that Ray had developed while repairing his father's broken instrument. "Dale Pritchard called yesterday," Ray said, watching a cement truck navigate the rough access road with the careful precision of someone who understood that some mistakes couldn't be fixed. "3rd time this month. Still trying to buy you out? Still trying to convince me that I'm in over my head, that running a foundation is different from winning a court case, that I should take his money and let professionals handle the complicated stuff." Leah studied Ray's face, looking for signs of doubt or second-guessing that might indicate Dale's persistent pressure was having an effect. "Are you tempted?" Quote. Ray considered the question seriously, Because temptation required more than just being offered something you wanted. It required believing that what you were being offered was actually better than what you already had. Sometimes, he admitted, when I look at the budget spreadsheets, or try to understand federal education regulations, or realize that I'm responsible for programs that could affect thousands of kids. But then I remember why we're doing this. He gestured toward the construction sites, where workers were preparing to install the first of the observatory domes. In a few months, that dome would house a telescope powerful enough to show visiting students the rings of Saturn, the moons of Jupiter, and objects that most people would never see without assistance. This isn't about me being qualified or professional or whatever Dale thinks I'm not. It's about making sure that kids like Sophia don't have to choose between curiosity and credentials, that they can start asking questions about the universe without worrying about whether they're smart enough or rich enough or educated enough to deserve answers. Sophia herself appeared at that moment, emerging from the construction trailer with architectural drawings tucked under her arm and the focused expression of someone who'd learned to navigate adult conversations with the confidence of an equal participant rather than a tolerated observer. At 17, she'd grown into her role as the Foundation's first official student researcher, spending her summer developing educational programs that would serve kids from backgrounds similar to her own. Her acceptance to the university's astrophysics program had made local news, but Ray was more proud of the way she'd learned to explain complex concepts to younger students without condescending to them. The classroom layouts look good, she reported, spreading the drawings across the hood of Ray's truck, but I think we need to reconsider the lighting in the workshop area. If kids are going to be doing precision work on telescope components, they need better illumination than what's currently planned. Ray studied the drawings, marveling at Sophia's ability to see practical problems that had escaped his notice. Working with her over the past months had taught him that intelligence wasn't just about having good ideas. It was about being able to spot the details that could make the difference between success and failure. What do you recommend? Quote, LED strips with adjustable brightness, positioned to minimize shadows when people are working with small parts. It'll add maybe $3,000 to the budget, but it'll make the workshop actually functional instead of just adequate. Ray made a note on the margin of the drawings, adding Sophia's suggestion to the growing list of modifications that were transforming the center from an abstract concept into a place where real learning could happen. The sound of an approaching vehicle made them all look up to see Miggs's Jeep navigating the access road with the casual skill of someone who'd learned to drive on desert terrain that would challenge most city drivers. He'd spent the summer working construction to earn money for college, but he devoted his evenings and weekends to the Foundation, developing websites and social media presence that had attracted attention from astronomy educators across the country. NASA called, Miggs announced as he climbed out of the Jeep, his work clothes dusty with the kind of desert grit that became part of everything in Arizona. They want to accelerate the mobile observatory timeline. Apparently, there's a school district in New Mexico that wants to pilot the program starting in October. Ray felt the familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that had become his constant companion since the Foundation moved from planning to implementation. Every success created new opportunities, and every opportunity revealed new challenges that required solutions he was still learning to provide. Are we ready for that? Depends on what you mean by ready, Miggs replied, accepting coffee from Dr. Kim with the grateful expression of someone who'd been working since dawn. The equipment is available, the curriculum is tested, and we have volunteers trained to operate the mobile units. The question is whether you're ready to trust other people to represent the Foundation in situations you can't directly supervise. It was a fair question, and one that Ray had been avoiding because the answer required admitting something he wasn't entirely comfortable with, that the Foundation had grown beyond his ability to personally oversee every aspect of its operation. Your father built something bigger than himself, Leah said gently, understanding the nature of Ray's hesitation. That was always the goal, wasn't it? To create programs that could reach more kids than any one person could teach individually? Quote. Ray nodded, though part of him missed the simplicity of those early evenings, when it had been just him and Sophia and a single telescope pointed at coordinates his father had spent 20 years calculating. Success was more complicated than failure, requiring trust and delegation and the willingness to let other people carry forward ideas that had started in his backyard. Tell NASA we're ready, Ray said finally, and schedule a training session for the New Mexico volunteers. If we're going to do this, we might as well do it right. That afternoon, Ray drove to the cemetery where Franklin was buried, carrying with him a small bronze plaque that had been cast with the coordinates of Asteroid 2003 FM and the inscription he saw further than seemed reasonable. The gravesite was simple. A flat marker in a section reserved for people whose families couldn't afford elaborate monuments. But Ray had always appreciated its unpretentious dignity. He knelt and placed the plaque beside the headstone, using a small trowel to secure it in the desert soil that had claimed so many dreamers and skeptics with equal indifference. "I think you'd be amazed," Ray said aloud, feeling only slightly self-conscious about talking to someone who couldn't answer back. "The foundation is going to reach thousands of kids, maybe more. NASA is helping us develop programs that will bring telescopes to schools that could never afford them otherwise. Sophia is going to study astrophysics and probably discover things that make your asteroid look like pocket change." A desert wind stirred the sagebrush around the cemetery, carrying the scent of creosote and the promise of rain that might or might not arrive before winter. Ray had learned to love this landscape's honesty, the way it offered beauty and harshness in equal measure without pretending to be something it wasn't. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you were trying to do," Ray continued, his voice carrying clearly in the desert silence. "I thought you chose the stars over your family, but maybe you were just trying to show us that there was more to choose from than we realized. Maybe the problem wasn't your obsession. Maybe it was that the rest of us weren't obsessed enough." He stood and brushed dust from his knees, looking up at the sky that would soon be dark enough for serious observation. Tonight he would drive back to the construction site where Sophia and Miggs and Dr. Kim would be waiting with notebooks full of plans for programs that could change how young people thought about their place in the universe. Franklin's telescope sat in Ray's truck, carefully secured in a case that protected it from the vibrations of desert driving. Tomorrow it would be installed in the Foundation's main observatory, where it would serve as both a functional instrument and a symbol of the persistence required to see things that other people missed. Ray drove home as the sun set behind mountains that had watched over generations of dreamers and skeptics, thinking about the strange paths that led from broken inheritances to functional legacies, from private obsessions to public institutions, from fathers who couldn't explain their love to sons who finally learned to understand it. The Foundation would officially open in 3 months, with a celebration that would bring together astronomers and educators and kids who'd learned that curiosity was more important than credentials. But the real opening had happened months ago, in Ray's backyard, when Sophia had asked her first question about the stars and Ray had realized that the best way to honor his father's memory was to help other people learn to look up. The Franklin Mendoza Center for Accessible Astronomy opened on a clear October evening when the desert air held the perfect balance between the heat of day and the cold of night. Ray stood before the main observatory dome, watching families stream across the parking lot with children who clutched handmade star charts and homemade telescopes built from PVC pipe and magnifying glasses. 3 months of final preparations had transformed the empty desert into something that looked like a small university campus. Solar panels powered LED lighting that minimized interference with astronomical observations. The main building housed classrooms equipped with computers that could connect to NASA databases, and a workshop where visitors could learn to grind their own telescope mirrors using techniques that hadn't changed much since Franklin's time. "You ready for this?" Miggs asked, adjusting the microphone clip to Ray's shirt collar. His son had grown into his role as the Foundation's communications director, managing everything from social media to the documentary crew that was filming tonight's opening ceremony. "Does anyone ever feel ready for something like this?" Ray replied, watching Sophia emerge from the visitor center with a group of middle school students from Phoenix who'd won a contest by designing their own constellation myths. At 18, Sophia had deferred her university admission for a year to serve as the Foundation's first student coordinator, developing programs that would eventually be replicated at other sites across the Southwest. She moved through the crowd with the confident grace of someone who'd learned to translate wonder into education, explaining complex concepts with the patience of someone who remembered what it felt like to encounter them for the first time. Dr. Kim appeared at Ray's elbow, carrying a tablet that displayed real-time data from the Foundation's 3 observatory domes. "All systems are green. We've got perfect viewing conditions tonight. No clouds, minimal atmospheric turbulence, and the moon won't rise until after midnight." Ray nodded, though his attention was focused on the crowd gathering around the main entrance. He recognized faces from the youth space camp, From the town meetings where people had debated whether he was visionary or deluded. From the courtroom where Judge Marlowe had ruled that dreams backed by documentation were more powerful than skepticism backed by money. But there were new faces too. Kids who'd driven hours with their parents to attend the opening. Teachers who'd heard about the Foundation's programs through NASA's educational network. Amateur astronomers who wanted to see what Franklin Mendoza's son had built from a broken telescope and a box of incomprehensible notes. As darkness settled over the desert, Ray climbed the steps to the small stage that had been erected beside the main dome. The crowd quieted, faces turning toward him with the expectant attention of people who'd gathered to witness something they hoped would matter. 6 months ago, Ray began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system that Miggs had tested obsessively. Most of you probably thought I was crazy. A small-town mechanic claiming ownership of an asteroid worth more than most people see in a lifetime. And maybe I was crazy. Crazy enough to believe that my father's 20-year obsession might have been something more than delusion. He gestured toward the observatory dome behind him, where Franklin's telescope had been installed as the centerpiece of the Foundation's permanent collection. But tonight isn't about vindication or court victories or proving that impossible things sometimes turn out to be true. Tonight is about the idea that curiosity belongs to everyone, that asking questions about the universe is more important than having perfect answers, that discovery is something you do rather than something you are. Ray paused, looking out at faces that ranged from 8 to 80, unified by the kind of wonder that had once driven his father to spend sleepless nights tracking invisible objects across the sky. Welcome to the Franklin Mendoza Center. Welcome to a place where looking up is the first step toward understanding that we're all made of stardust, and that the light we see tonight traveled millions of years just to reach our eyes. Welcome to a place where dreams and documentation can coexist, where broken things can be fixed, and where every clear night is another chance to discover that the universe is more beautiful and more accessible than we ever dared to imagine. The applause that followed felt like thunder rolling across the desert, but Ray was already moving toward the observatory dome, where Sophia was helping the first group of visitors line up for their turn at his father's telescope. Tonight, under stars that burned with the same light Franklin had spent his life studying, the real work would begin, the patient, joyful task of helping other people learn to see. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.